Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back, way back, into the hushed, cavernous spaces of an ancient library. Picture this. You're walking along a dusty street, the sun beating down, the scent of olive oil, and something vaguely animal in the air. Suddenly, you turn a corner and see a grand building, perhaps with towering columns, or maybe just a simple, unassuming facade. But from within, a cool, dry air seems to beckon. You push open a heavy door, and the world outside, with its clamor and vibrant chaos, simply melts away. The light inside is soft, filtered through high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. A faint, earthy scent, like old paper and dried herbs, fills your nostrils. You hear the whisper of sandals on stone floors, the rustle of papyrus, a quiet cough from a distant corner. This isn't your local bookstore with its cheerful coffee shop and bright fluorescent lights. Oh no, you're entering a realm where silence reigns supreme, where knowledge is painstakingly preserved by hand, and where a single drop scroll could shatter hours of someone's meticulous work. You probably won't survive 5 minutes in this place before you accidentally sneeze on a priceless manuscript or, worse, track in mud. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you step further into the antechamber, your eyes begin to adjust to the dim light. The sheer scale of the place is astounding. You see shelves stretching higher than you thought possible, filled not with the neat, rectangular spines of modern books, but with countless rolled-up cylinders of scrolls. Each one a testament to immense labor and a single, flickering thought from someone long, long ago. The air feels dense, thick with the weight of centuries of human thought and experience. It's cool, almost chilly, a welcome respite from the sweltering heat outside. You can almost feel the presence of ancient scholars, their quiet murmurs echoing in the vast space. Historians still argue whether the largest ancient libraries truly had dedicated reading rooms or if scholars simply huddled near the shelves, unrolling scrolls wherever they could find a patch of decent light. Imagine trying to read an entire epic poem, holding a heavy scroll in near darkness, while someone else nearby scratches away with a reed pen. Sounds like my kind of party. You might notice the subtle scent of cedar, too, which was often used to repel insects, as surprisingly practical and quite pleasant aroma for a place dedicated to preserving delicate papyri. Sometimes, you'd even find small jars of cedar oil or fragrant resins tucked among the scrolls. They were, in a way, the ancient library's equivalent of those little moisture-absorbing packets you find in new shoes, only much more fragrant and, arguably, less efficient. The sense of peace here is profound, a stark contrast to the bustling world outside. It's a place where time itself seems to slow, where the hurried pace of daily life is replaced by the steady, quiet rhythm of contemplation and preservation. It's easy to see how one could lose oneself here, not just for an hour or two, but for days, weeks, even a lifetime. The sheer volume of information, even in a world without printing presses, is staggering. As you wander deeper into the library, past those towering shelves, you start to notice the very materials themselves. This isn't paper as you know it. Oh no, you're looking at papyrus and parchment, two very different and equally fascinating ancient technologies. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer effort involved in creating just one of these scrolls. It's enough to make you appreciate your Kindle, isn't it? Let's start with papyrus. If you were in ancient Egypt or even Greece and Rome, this was the go-to material. Papyrus isn't paper. It's made from the pith of the papyrus plant, which grew abundantly along the Nile. Picture tall, reedy stalks almost like bamboo. To make a sheet, they'd strip off the outer green rind and then slice the inner white pith into thin strips. And I mean thin, like delicate ribbons. These strips were then laid out side by side, overlapping slightly on a hard surface. Then, another layer of strips would be laid on top, at a 90-degree angle to the first. It's like a very, very old-school weaving project, but with plant fibers. Once those 2 layers were down, they'd press them. Hard. Really hard. This pressure, along with the natural stickiness of the plant sap, would bind the strips together. Think of it like a giant, leafy laminate. After pressing, the sheets were dried and then painstakingly polished with some kind of smooth stone or shell to create a writing surface that was less prone to snagging a reed pen. The resulting sheets would be joined together end to end to form a long roll, sometimes many meters long. Imagine trying to roll up a scroll that's longer than a bowling alley. One quirk: papyrus has a natural grain, so you could really only write comfortably on one side, which they called the recto. Writing on the verso of the back was awkward and rare, usually reserved for notes or rough drafts. It's a bit like trying to write on the fuzzy side of a sticky note. It just doesn't feel right. Then there's parchment, which became more popular, especially in the later Roman Empire and throughout the medieval period. This stuff is made from animal skin, usually sheep, goat, or calf. Yes, you heard that right. Fluffy sheep eventually became someone's bedtime story. The process for parchment was even more elaborate and, frankly, a bit smellier. First, the animal skin would be soaked in a lime solution to remove the hair and fat. Then it would be stretched taut on a frame, almost like a canvas, and scraped repeatedly with a curved knife to remove any remaining flesh or hair follicles. This scraping process, done meticulously while the skin was still damp, would thin the material and make it incredibly smooth. After drying, it might be rubbed with pumice stone and chalk to achieve that perfect, velvety writing surface. The beauty of parchment is its durability. It's incredibly strong, resistant to tearing, and unlike papyrus, you could write on both sides. This meant you could fit a lot more information into a single book, which eventually led to the development of the codex, what we recognize as a modern book with folded pages bound together. Historians still argue whether the transition from scroll to codex was driven more by practical convenience, like easier navigation and storage, or by cultural shifts in reading habits. But honestly, unwrapping a scroll the length of a small car every time you wanted to find a specific passage sounds like a fantastic way to develop carpal tunnel syndrome, so my money's on convenience. Imagine trying to find a specific recipe in a 20-foot long scroll. You'd be hungry before you even found the appetizers. The tactile difference between the crisp, sometimes brittle, papyrus and the soft, supple parchment is quite striking, even after millennia. Each material tells its own quiet story of ancient craftsmanship and the relentless human desire to record. With the raw materials prepared, our journey into the secret lives of books now brings us to the scribes themselves. Imagine stepping into a vast, quiet hall, perhaps with light streaming in from high windows, illuminating countless small wooden desks. Here, hunched over their work, are the scribes, the human printing presses of the ancient world. Their daily grind was one of intense focus, immense patience, and often incredible monotony. This wasn't a job for the fidgety. You see them, quill or reed pen in hand, meticulously copying text, line by line, letter by letter, onto the prepared papyrus or parchment. Their tools were simple but essential: a sharp reed pen for papyrus, or a more flexible quill pen, often from a goose feather, for the smoother parchment. For ink, they'd use a mixture of soot or lamp black, gum arabic, a natural binder from acacia trees, and water. This ink, when dry, was permanent and resistant to fading, though not always to smudging if you weren't careful. Imagine accidentally dragging your sleeve across a freshly written line of Homer. The horror. One popular ancient ink recipe also included octopus ink, which probably smelled a bit like a fishing boat in a good way, if you like that sort of thing. Their routine was relentless. A scribe might spend an entire day, or even a week, on a single long scroll, their hand cramping, their eyes straining in the dim light. They worked in silence, or perhaps to the soft rustle of their own movements and the occasional clearing of a throat. Errors were, of course, inevitable. A misplaced letter, a skipped word, A line accidentally duplicated these were the bane of a scribe's existence. Correcting them could be tricky, especially on papyrus where erasure was difficult. On parchment, you might be able to scrape away a mistake with a sharp knife, but that left a visible mark. Historians still argue whether scribes were primarily focused on speed or accuracy, though certainly, the more valuable a text, the more accuracy was prized. It was a painstaking, almost meditative process, and one that required an incredible depth of concentration. No TikTok breaks here, thank goodness. They didn't just copy. Sometimes, a scribe might add a colophon at the end of a text, a small note where they might record the date, the person who commissioned the work, or even a personal lament about the difficulties of the job. I finished this book, thank the gods, or may the next scribe suffer less than I, might be typical sentiments. You might even find tiny, almost imperceptible doodles or the occasional cheeky note in the margins, the ancient equivalent of passing a note in class. It's comforting to know that even thousands of years ago, people got bored and doodled little stick figures when their boss wasn't looking. Sometimes these notes would be instructions for a later artist, indicating where an illustration or a decorative initial should be added, marking the boundaries for another craftsman's touch. The conditions for scribes varied wildly. Some worked in grand, state-sponsored libraries, enjoying the quiet dignity of scholarly work. Others might have been enslaved, forced to copy text for their master's personal library or for sale, with no choice in the matter. Imagine copying endless scrolls of tax records for someone else's benefit. Talk about boring. But regardless of their status, their contribution was invaluable. Without their tireless dedication, the vast majority of ancient knowledge would have been lost to the winds of time, fading away like unwritten whispers. They were the unsung heroes of literacy, the quiet engines that drove the spread of ideas, one careful stroke at a time. Now that we've seen the scribes at work, let's consider the daunting task that faced the ancient librarians, cataloging and organizing these vast collections of scrolls. Imagine a room, or perhaps a series of rooms, filled with thousands upon thousands of these rolled-up texts, each one looking remarkably similar to the next. Without a systematic way to know what was where, a library, no matter how grand, would quickly devolve into a chaotic, unusable mess. It's like trying to find a specific sock in a laundry basket the size of a small house. Good luck with that. Ancient librarians, bless their meticulous souls, developed surprisingly complex systems for managing their collections. They didn't have Dewey Decimal or Library of Congress classifications, but they certainly had their own methods. For a very long time, libraries would simply organize scrolls by subject matter. All the philosophy scrolls over here, all the history scrolls over there, and so on. But even within those broad categories, how do you find a specific work? This is where the tag came in. Imagine a small, wooden or papyrus tag, called a syllabus or titulus, tied to the end of each scroll. On this tag, the scribe or librarian would write the title of the work and the author's name. This meant you didn't have to unroll every scroll just to see what it was. A little ingenuity goes a long way, doesn't it? For larger, more sophisticated libraries, like the legendary Library of Alexandria, they would create scroll catalogs themselves. These were essentially inventories, often organized by subject, author, or even chronologically by when a scroll entered the collection. The most famous example is the Pinox of Callimachus, the chief librarian of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. This was a massive 120-volume catalog that listed works by author, broken down by genre. It included not just the title and author, but also the first line of the text, a brief summary, and even the number of lines or scrolls the work comprised. Think of it as the world's first, incredibly detailed bibliography. Historians still argue whether the Pinox was primarily a finding aid for readers or a comprehensive inventory for the librarians, but its sheer ambition speaks volumes about the administrative sophistication of ancient scholarship. One quirky tidbit: sometimes scrolls were stored in wooden boxes or compartments, and these containers might have their own labels, further aiding in organization. So you might have a box labeled Greek tragedies, and within it, individual scrolls, each with their silly boss. It's almost like nesting dolls of knowledge. And because scrolls were often written in columns, a librarian might even mark the column number on the outside of the scroll. So if you were looking for a specific passage, you could jump right to the right section without having to unroll the entire thing. It was their version of a table of contents, but on the outside of the book. The practicalities of retrieval were also considered. Scrolls might be shelved horizontally or vertically, depending on the library's design and the fragility of the papyrus. Imagine a librarian needing to climb a ladder to retrieve a specific scroll from a high shelf, carefully pulling it down without disturbing its neighbors. It was a slow, deliberate process, unlike the instantaneous digital searches we take for granted today. There was no Control plus F in ancient Rome, sadly. The quiet, methodical nature of this cataloging work contributed immensely to the longevity of ancient texts. Without these dedicated individuals meticulously organizing and preserving, much more would have simply vanished into the sands of time, lost forever in the uncatalogued chaos. Their efforts were the quiet bedrock upon which the entire edifice of ancient scholarship rested. Despite the best efforts of our meticulous librarians and their clever cataloging systems, ancient books faced an array of formidable threats. Imagine, if you will, the constant anxiety of living in a world where a single spark, a sudden downpour, or even a particularly determined insect could spell the end of centuries of accumulated wisdom. It's enough to make a modern archivist hyperventilate. The most dramatic, and perhaps the most famous, threat was fire. Libraries, often housed in large, open buildings, were incredibly vulnerable. Many ancient cities, built largely of wood and other flammable materials, were prone to devastating conflagrations. The famous Library of Alexandria, for instance, is often cited as having been destroyed by fire, though historians still argue whether it was a single catastrophic event or a series of smaller, more gradual destructions over centuries. Imagine the sheer heartbreak of watching smoke billow from a building that housed the collective knowledge of a known world, knowing that once those papyrus scrolls turned to ash, that information was gone forever. No cloud backups, no digital recovery. Just gone. But fire wasn't the only enemy. Water was just as insidious. Floods burst pipes. Yes, ancient Rome had impressive plumbing, which could also occasionally spring a leak. Or even just prolonged dampness could turn papyrus into an unreadable, moldy mess. Parchment fared a little better against moisture, but still succumbed to mold and mildew over time. Imagine painstakingly copying a philosophical treatise for months, only for a leaky roof to turn it into a soggy, green-tinged lump. It's like spilling coffee on your laptop, but a million times worse, and without the option of just buying a new one. Then there were the less dramatic, but equally relentless, biological threats. Insects, particularly bookworms, which are actually beetle larvae, not worms, had a voracious appetite for papyrus and parchment. These tiny, silent destroyers could tunnel through scrolls, rendering sections unreadable. Imagine opening a scroll only to find a perfectly carved tunnel winding its way through critical historical data. It's enough to give you the creepy crawlies, even if you're just thinking about it. Rodents were also a problem, chewing through materials for nests or simply out of curiosity. And finally, mold and mildew thrived in damp, warm conditions, slowly but surely eating away at the organic materials. This is why libraries were often designed with good ventilation and dry storage in mind, and why cedar oil was a common repellent. Human threats were also a factor. Warfare often led to the deliberate destruction or accidental loss of libraries. Conquerors sometimes viewed libraries as symbols of the enemy's culture, leading to their intentional burning. Or simply, battles fought within city walls could lead to collateral damage. Imagine trying to evacuate thousands of fragile scrolls in the middle of a siege. Not exactly practical. And, of course, the simple passage of time itself, combined with continuous handling, caused materials to degrade. Even the most carefully preserved scroll would eventually become brittle and fragile, its ink fading. The peculiar habit of some later scribes to scrape off older texts to reuse expensive parchment for new works, known as a palimpsest, also contributed to the loss of unique knowledge. Historians still argue whether the destruction of ancient libraries was primarily due to accidental calamities or deliberate acts of cultural annihilation, but the result was always the same: a profound, irretrievable loss. The discussion of threats naturally brings us to a more somber, yet utterly fascinating topic: the lost scrolls and hidden knowledge that have vanished from the historical record. Imagine for a moment that countless narratives, scientific discoveries, and philosophical treatises simply evaporated. It's a concept both heartbreaking and deeply intriguing, a vast, echoing silence where once there were voices. Think of all the works we know existed, even had titles for, but which are now completely lost. The Penox of Callimachus, that incredibly detailed catalog we mentioned, actually listed many texts that we no longer possess. It's like having a library inventory from ancient times, but half the items are marked missing. For instance, we know that Aristotle wrote numerous dialogues and poems beyond his surviving philosophical treatises, but only fragments or references remain. Imagine reading a comedy written by Aristotle. It just sounds like it would be hilariously awkward, doesn't it? Or what about the lost plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides? We have perhaps a dozen or so plays from each, but they wrote hundreds. The vast majority, including entire trilogies, have simply vanished, swallowed by time, fire, or neglect. It's like having only a few songs from a legendary band's entire discography. One particularly poignant loss is the majority of ancient Greek and Roman comedies, especially those from the New Comedy period. While we have many fragments and summaries, only one playwright, Menander, has significant portions of his work surviving, thanks largely to papyrus discoveries in Egypt. Most of his contemporaries' works are gone. Imagine missing out on thousands of ancient jokes, observations about daily life, and character studies that could have given us a richer, more nuanced understanding of their world. We're left piecing together their humor from tantalizing whispers. Sometimes a text might survive, but only in a later, often biased, summary or quotation by another author. We might read a criticism of a philosopher's work, but never get to read the original work itself to form our own judgment. It's like trying to understand a movie by only reading negative reviews of it. You get an idea, but you miss the full picture. This phenomenon leaves modern scholars scrambling to reconstruct lost arguments from tiny crumbs of evidence. Historians still argue whether the loss of these texts truly changed the course of Western thought, or if the essential ideas simply found other avenues of expression. A quirky, almost hopeful, aspect of this loss is the ongoing discovery of new texts, often from unlikely places. The dry sands of Egypt have been a gold mine, preserving papyrus fragments for millennia. The famous Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves in the Judean desert, revealed ancient religious texts previously thought lost or only known through later translations. More recently, carbonized scrolls from Herculaneum, buried by the eruption of Vesuvius, are slowly being deciphered using advanced imaging techniques, a process so delicate it's like unwrapping ancient, burnt crisps. Imagine patiently peeling apart a scroll that literally turned to charcoal, hoping to find a hidden philosophical treatise from someone you've only ever read about. It's a testament to the enduring human desire to recover what's lost, to fill in those echoing silences. Each fragment recovered, each word deciphered, is a quiet victory against the relentless march of oblivion, a faint whisper from a forgotten voice in the ancient library. Our journey through the ancient library would be incomplete without understanding the role of patronage and imperial power. These vast collections weren't just grassroots efforts. They were often grand, often political, statements funded by emperors, kings, and incredibly wealthy individuals. Imagine trying to build a modern university library without a massive endowment or government funding. It's practically impossible. The same held true, perhaps even more so, in the ancient world. The most famous example, of course, is the Library of Alexandria, established in the 3rd century BCE by the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt. This wasn't just a building. It was an entire research institution, part of the larger Museion, Temple of the Muses. The Ptolemies poured immense resources into it, actively seeking to acquire every known text in the world. They sent agents across the Mediterranean to buy, borrow, and even brazenly steal scrolls. Legend has it that ships docking at Alexandria had their scrolls confiscated and copied, with the originals kept for the library and the copies returned to the owners. Talk about a strict interlibrary loan policy. This aggressive acquisition policy wasn't just about scholarship. It was also a display of wealth, power, and cultural supremacy. Look at us. The Ptolemies were essentially saying, we have all the books. In Rome, emperors and wealthy citizens also played a huge role. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, established 2 major public libraries in Rome. Later emperors continued this tradition, recognizing that libraries were not just places of learning, but also symbols of imperial grandeur and beneficence. They were monuments to intellectual achievement, reflecting well on the ruler who funded them. Imagine commissioning a new library wing and putting your name, in giant letters, right over the entrance. It's a subtle form of ancient advertising, isn't it? Wealthy private citizens also built impressive personal libraries, often opening them to a select circle of friends and scholars. These private collections were sometimes even more specialized and unique than the public ones. This system of patronage meant that the content of libraries could be heavily influenced by the tastes and political agendas of their benefactors. An emperor who favored certain philosophers might ensure their works were prominently collected, while others might be overlooked. Historians still argue whether this imperial influence primarily served to preserve a wider range of knowledge or inadvertently led to the neglect and eventual loss of texts deemed politically inconvenient or unfashionable. It's a delicate balance, isn't it? The very hand that feeds the library can also, perhaps unconsciously, shape its intellectual diet. A quirky detail about Roman public libraries is that they were sometimes dual language. One section for Greek texts, another for Latin. This reflected Rome's reverence for Greek culture and its adoption of Greek as the language of high scholarship. So you could wander from the Homer section to the Virgil section, all under the same grand roof. It's a charming detail that highlights the cultural blend of the Roman world. The very existence of these grand, publicly accessible, to a degree, libraries was a testament to the idea that knowledge, even if controlled by the elite, was a valuable resource for the empire. It fostered intellectual discourse, provided resources for administrators and jurists, and, of course, offered a quiet refuge for weary scholars. With these grand libraries established and filled, a crucial question arises. Who actually got to read these precious texts? The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that access was largely elite and often restricted. This wasn't a free-for-all public library like we enjoy today, where you can wander in, grab a novel, and settle into a comfy chair. Oh no, this was a more exclusive affair. For starters, literacy itself was not widespread. While it varied by era and region, a significant portion of the population in ancient Greece and Rome, let alone other parts of the world, couldn't read at all or only possessed very basic literacy for practical purposes like keeping accounts. So, right off the bat, the potential readership was limited to a relatively small segment of society: scholars, philosophers, government officials, wealthy elites, and some specialized professionals. Imagine having a library card, but only if you had a PhD, in ancient Greek, and a personal letter of recommendation from an emperor. Even for the literate, gaining entry to a major library might require connections. Public libraries in Rome were certainly more accessible than private collections, but they still weren't open to everyone. You might need to be a citizen, or perhaps have a letter of introduction from a patron. The greatest scholars and philosophers, of course, who have privileged access, often spending their days studying and teaching within the library walls. They were the original regulars, nursing their scrolls instead of lattes. The social implications of this restricted access were profound. Knowledge was, to a large extent, controlled by the powerful. The texts housed in these libraries reinforced existing social hierarchies and philosophical traditions. Imagine a world where the only people who could read Plato were those already at the top of society. It certainly didn't encourage revolutionary thinking from the masses, did it? Historians still argue whether the limited access to knowledge in ancient libraries primarily served to maintain social order or was simply a practical consequence of the high cost of creating and preserving texts. It's a chicken and egg situation with a lot of papyrus. A quirky detail to consider is the actual act of reading itself. Remember, most texts were on scrolls. This wasn't a comfortable experience. You had to unroll one end with one hand and roll up the other end with your other hand, often needing both hands and a degree of dexterity. For longer works, this could be a physical workout. Imagine trying to relax and fall asleep while wrestling a 20-foot scroll. And reading silently, as we do today, was less common than reading aloud, even to oneself. Many ancient people would murmur the words as they read, a practice that helped them process the text and sometimes to catch errors. So, the ancient library, while quiet by modern standards, might not have been entirely silent. You might hear the gentle murmur of a dozen different voices, each engaged in their own quiet communion with the written word. It might have been like a very subdued hum or a soft, constant whisper, a truly soothing sound for drifting off to sleep. As you continue your silent stroll through the aisles of papyrus and parchment, your eyes might occasionally catch something unexpected, a tiny sketch, a scrawled note, or a cryptic symbol. Welcome to the world of curious marginalia and hidden jokes, the secret messages left behind by bored, tired, or sometimes mischievous scribes. These aren't just random marks. They're whispers from the past, adding a wonderfully human touch to these ancient artifacts. Scribes, as we established, had a remarkably monotonous job. Imagine copying the same philosophical treatise for weeks on end, with nothing but your own thoughts for company. It's no wonder their minds sometimes wandered. So, occasionally when a scribe reached the end of a long, particularly tedious section, they might just doodle a little picture in the margin. You might find anything from simple geometric patterns to surprisingly elaborate little faces, animals, or even tiny architectural sketches. It's the ancient equivalent of doodling in your notebook during a really dull lecture. One famous example is a tiny, almost cartoonish image of a devil with a pitchfork, found in a medieval manuscript, clearly a scribe expressing their frustration with the difficult text or perhaps a particularly annoying colleague. Beyond simple doodles, you might find marginal notes that reveal the scribe's own thoughts or feelings about the text they were copying. Sometimes these are practical. This passage is difficult to read, or check this date. But other times, they are far more personal, even humorous. A scribe might complain about the cold, the dim light, the lack of food, or even the quality of the wine. Imagine reading a serious historical account and suddenly finding a scribe's exasperated note in the margin. "Oh, bother. My hand aches from writing all this." It's a delightful reminder that these ancient texts were created by real people, with real frustrations and senses of humor. Historians still argue whether these personal marginalia were meant to be seen by future readers or were simply private expressions of a tired hand. Perhaps a bit of both, a quiet rebellion against the solemnity of their task. One of the most charming examples of hidden jokes comes from a medieval manuscript, where a scribe, after meticulously copying a long and rather dry religious text, added a note at the very end. "Thank God, I have finished this work. I pray for a good dinner tonight." It's an incredibly relatable sentiment, isn't it? Another common type of marginalia is the manicule, literally little hand, a pointing finger drawn in the margin to draw attention to a particularly important or interesting passage. These vary wildly in style, from simple arrows to intricately decorated hands, often with a little cuff or sleeve. It's like the ancient version of a highlighter, but with far more personality. These quirky additions offer a rare glimpse into the personality of the anonymous scribes. They remind us that even in the most serious of settings, human nature finds a way to express itself, to add a personal touch. These aren't just errors or random marks. They're the quiet, unspoken conversations between the scribe and the text, and sometimes between the scribe and you, the future reader. They break through the solemnity of the ancient library, offering a little chuckle or a moment of shared humanity across millennia. Beyond the philosophical treatises and historical accounts, ancient libraries were also invaluable repositories of scientific texts and records of ancient inventions. Imagine a quiet corner of the library, not filled with epic poetry, but with scrolls detailing the workings of complex machines, astronomical observations, or medical remedies. It's a fascinating glimpse into the ancient world's practical and intellectual curiosity. Consider the wealth of Greek and Roman engineering texts. We know of treatises detailing everything from siege engines to aqueducts, from complex lifting cranes to ingenious water clocks. Heron of Alexandria, for example, wrote extensively on mechanics, optics, and pneumatics, describing devices like steam-powered engines, though never widely adopted for practical use, and automatons. Imagine reading a detailed schematic for a coin-operated holy water dispenser, a device Heron designed for temples. It's quirky, ingenious, and perhaps a little bit unnecessary. These texts weren't just theoretical. They were often practical manuals, guides for builders, engineers, and artisans. Historians still argue whether the theoretical scientific advancements recorded in these texts were consistently applied in everyday ancient life or remained largely in the realm of academic pursuit. Then there's the field of medicine. Libraries house the works of Hippocrates, Galen, and countless other physicians whose observations and treatments formed the bedrock of Western medicine for centuries. You'd find detailed descriptions of anatomical knowledge, often gleaned from animal dissection, as human dissection was taboo for a long time, surgical procedures, and elaborate lists of herbal remedies. Imagine a scroll describing a sophisticated surgery or a detailed list of ingredients for a poultice, written in a language that now sounds like a forgotten spell. It's both oddly comforting and slightly unnerving to realize how much of ancient medical practice was based on observation and trial and error, sometimes with surprisingly effective results, other times less so. One particular fringe tidbit: some ancient medical texts even discussed rudimentary forms of ancient dentistry, including the extraction of teeth and the use of early prosthetics. Imagine sitting in a dentist's chair in ancient Rome, reading a scroll about how to fix your toothache using pulverized mouse brains. Makes you appreciate modern dentistry, doesn't it? Astronomy and mathematics also held prominent places. Works by Euclid on geometry, Archimedes on mechanics and hydrostatics, and Ptolemy on astronomy were meticulously copied and preserved. These texts allowed future generations to build upon existing knowledge, leading to advancements in navigation, timekeeping, and understanding the cosmos. Imagine a scribe copying page after page of complex mathematical equations, perhaps not fully understanding their implications but knowing their importance. It's a quiet testament to the faith in the power of pure knowledge. These scientific and technical texts were not just dry lists of facts. They often included diagrams and illustrations, allowing for a clearer understanding of complex concepts. They provided the intellectual scaffolding for ancient civilization, preserving not just stories and philosophies, but the practical wisdom and ingenious thinking that built empires and solved everyday problems. They offered a quiet testament to humanity's enduring quest to understand and manipulate the world around them, a quest that continued, slowly and steadily, within the hushed walls of the ancient library. Stepping away from the purely scientific, our quiet exploration of the ancient library now leads us into the wonderfully diverse realms of maps, myths, and monster manuals. Imagine the thrill of unrolling a scroll not filled with dry philosophy, but with a vibrant depiction of the known world, or a thrilling account of heroic gods, or even a detailed description of mythical beasts. These texts offered escape, instruction, and a window into the ancient imagination. Let's begin with maps. While not maps as we know them today, highly accurate, to scale representations, ancient maps were invaluable. They were often more conceptual, illustrating trade routes, significant cities, or the flow of rivers. The famous Tabula Pugnaria, though a later medieval copy of a Roman original, gives you a sense of this. It's a long, narrow scroll showing the road network of the Roman Empire, like an ancient Google Maps for long-distance travel. Imagine tracing your finger along the scroll, planning a journey from Rome to Antioch, noting the milestones and rest stops. One quirky detail is that these maps often distorted geography to emphasize important locations, making major cities much larger than their actual scale. Because, let's be honest, who cares about the accuracy of a small village when Rome is right there? Historians still argue whether these road maps were primarily practical guides for travelers or more symbolic representations of imperial control and connectivity. Then there are the myths. The ancient library was the ultimate repository of epic poems like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Hesiod's Theogony, and countless other tales of gods, goddesses, heroes, and their incredible adventures. These weren't just stories, they were the very fabric of ancient culture, religion, and identity. Imagine reading a scroll detailing Zeus's latest escapade or Odysseus' struggles to get home, feeling the quiet rhythm of the verses as they transport you to a world of divine intervention and human folly. It's like discovering the original scripts for all your favorite superhero movies, only much, much older and probably requiring a lot more rolling and unrolling. And of course, what's a world of myths without monster manuals? While perhaps not manuals in the Dungeons and Dragons sense, ancient texts were rife with descriptions of terrifying and fantastical creatures. Think of the Gorgons, the Minotaur, the Hydra, or the Sphinx. These creatures often appeared in epic poems, historical accounts, sometimes taken quite seriously as real threats, and even philosophical works as metaphors. Pliny the Elder's natural history, for instance, while mostly factual, includes descriptions of mythical beasts alongside real animals, showcasing the blurry line between scientific observation and folklore in the ancient mind. Imagine a scribe meticulously copying a passage about a three-headed dog guarding the underworld, perhaps with a slight shiver down their spine, even though they knew it was just a story. The sheer variety of these creatures is astounding, from the subtly uncanny to the overtly monstrous, reflecting the anxieties and wonders of the ancient world. They are a reminder that even in the quiet pursuit of knowledge, the human imagination always finds a way to weave in a bit of magic and a touch of the terrifying. As you continue to softly drift through the ancient library, let's turn our attention to the visual artistry of the written word itself. Beyond the content, the very act of writing involved distinct styles: cursive, calligraphy, and even cryptography. These weren't just functional. They were often aesthetic, reflecting the skill of the scribe and the purpose of the text. First, let's talk about cursive. When you think of ancient writing, you might picture neat, blocky capital letters, like inscriptions on a monument. And while monumental script existed, for everyday writing, a more flowing, joined-up style developed: ancient cursive. Imagine a busy Roman merchant quickly jotting down inventory or a legal document. They wouldn't have time for slow, careful block letters. Cursive was faster, more fluid, designed for efficiency. This style of writing was used for letters, administrative documents, and even rough drafts of literary works. It's a bit like the difference between handwriting a formal letter versus scribbling a quick grocery list today. The forms could be quite abbreviated, sometimes making them notoriously difficult for modern scholars to decipher. So, if you ever feel bad about your own messy handwriting, just know that ancient scribes probably made far worse scribbles when they were in a hurry. Then there's calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing. For important literary works, sacred texts, or deluxe copies commissioned by wealthy patrons, scribes would employ highly formalized, elegant scripts. This wasn't about speed, it was about beauty and legibility. Letters would be carefully formed, with consistent spacing and sometimes decorative flourishes. The ink might be richer and the parchment smoother. Imagine a scribe spending an entire day perfecting just a few lines of an epic poem, ensuring every character was a work of art. These calligraphic masterpieces were truly stunning, designed to be admired as much for their visual appeal as for their content. Historians still argue whether the development of specific calligraphic styles was driven more by artistic expression or by practical concerns of legibility in different lighting conditions. And finally, we have cryptography, the fascinating world of secret codes within ancient texts. While not as widespread as a modern military cipher, ancient cultures certainly had methods for concealing messages. Julius Caesar, for instance, famously used a simple substitution cipher, now known as the Caesar cipher, where each letter in the plain text was shifted a certain number of places. Having explored the scribes, the materials, and the hidden quirks of ancient books, let's now consider the quiet, scholarly life of the librarian themselves. This wasn't a job for the faint of heart, or for those who preferred a lot of exciting public drama. It was a role of immense responsibility, quiet dedication, and often profound intellectual influence. The head librarian of a major ancient library, like the one at Alexandria or Pergamum, was often a scholar of immense repute, a revered figure in their own right. They weren't just shelf stackers. They were critical thinkers, literary critics, and sometimes even tutors to royalty. Their primary duties included overseeing the acquisition of new scrolls, managing the scribes and copyists, ensuring the proper preservation of the collection, and, of course, assisting scholars and readers in finding the text they needed. Imagine being in charge of the entire intellectual output of the known world. It's a lot of pressure, isn't it? One of the most famous head librarians of Alexandria was Eratosthenes, who was not only a librarian, but also a brilliant mathematician, geographer, and astronomer, famous for calculating the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy using remarkably simple tools. So, these were not just bookkeepers. They were often polymaths themselves. The daily tasks of a librarian would have been surprisingly varied, though always rooted in the care of the collection. They'd inspect new acquisitions, deciding whether to purchase or copy them. They'd manage the scribal workshops, ensuring quality control and adherence to standards. They'd probably spend a good deal of time mediating disputes between scholars over access to rare scrolls, or perhaps even over the correct interpretation of a particularly thorny philosophical passage. "Excuse me, sir, but Plato clearly meant this, not that," might have been a common refrain in hushed tones. Preservation was a constant concern. Librarians would oversee repairs to damaged scrolls, perhaps re-rolling them, or even commissioning new copies if a scroll was too fragile to handle. They were the original conservators, understanding the delicate nature of their materials and the importance of preventing decay. They might also supervise the application of insect repellents, like that cedar oil we mentioned, to keep the dreaded bookworms at bay. It's a bit like being the head chef in a five-star restaurant, but instead of food, you're curating and preserving priceless intellectual feasts. Historians still argue whether ancient librarians primarily saw themselves as guardians of existing knowledge or as active facilitators of new research and scholarship. Most likely, it was a blend of both. They provided the resources for intellectual inquiry while also shaping the intellectual landscape through their acquisition policies and cataloging choices. A quirky aspect of some ancient libraries is that they sometimes included gardens or walking paths, providing a serene environment for scholars to contemplate and discuss. So, a librarian might have taken a break from managing scrolls to join a quiet philosophical debate under a shady tree, a truly tranquil scene. Their quiet dedication, often toiling in relative obscurity, ensured that the flickering flame of ancient knowledge continued to burn brightly, illuminating the path for future generations. As our quiet journey through the ancient library nears its end, you might find yourself feeling a strange connection to these long-gone spaces. It's a connection that bridges millennia, because the echoes of these ancient libraries resonate powerfully in our modern libraries today. While the materials and technologies have transformed beyond recognition, the core purpose, the very spirit of the library, remains remarkably unchanged. Think about it. The idea of a central repository of knowledge, accessible to a community, is a direct legacy of those ancient collections. When you walk into your local public library, with its hushed reading rooms and endless shelves, you are experiencing a continuity of purpose that stretches all the way back to Alexandria. The quiet dignity of a library, that sense of reverence for the written word, is an inheritance from those ancient halls. Historians still argue whether the concept of universal access to knowledge truly began in the Enlightenment or has roots in certain ancient libraries that were more open to the public than others. Consider the role of a librarian. While modern librarians use sophisticated digital systems and focus on information literacy, their fundamental role as guardians and facilitators of knowledge remains the same as their ancient counterparts. They still acquire, organize, preserve, and help people find information. Instead of grappling with crumbling papyrus, they might be wrestling with server space or digital rights management. But the mission is identical. And yes, they still probably occasionally have to deal with a particularly noisy patron, though perhaps not one complaining about the cold as much as their ancient colleagues did. Even the architecture of modern libraries sometimes subtly nods to the past. High ceilings, grand reading rooms, and that pervasive sense of quiet contemplation are all elements that evoke the feeling of ancient scholarly spaces. That distinct library smell, a mix of old paper, dust, and human presence-size a modern, less exotic version of the cedar and dried papyrus scent you might have encountered in our ancient library. It's a comforting, familiar aroma for anyone who loves books. The threats to knowledge have also evolved, but still persist. While we don't worry as much about literal bookworms, thank goodness for climate control. We face new challenges like digital obsolescence, cybersecurity threats, and the sheer volume of information that needs to be preserved. We're still fighting against the forces of decay and loss, just on a different battlefield. Imagine if all digital records suddenly vanished. It's the modern equivalent of a library burning down. These ancient libraries, with their quiet rituals and dedicated custodians, laid the groundwork for every library that followed. They established the foundational principles of collecting, organizing, and preserving knowledge, passing the torch from one generation to the next. Every time you pick up a book, physical or digital, you're benefiting from a tradition that began with meticulous scribes and quiet librarians in dusty halls under flickering lamplight, ensuring that the wisdom of the past wouldn't simply fade away. It's a truly comforting thought, isn't it? This unbroken chain of knowledge? As the quiet hum of the ancient library begins to fade and the scent of papyrus slowly dissipates from your imagination, let's take one final, calming walk through these whispering stacks. Our journey tonight has been a gentle reminder of the enduring power of the written word and the silent dedication of those who preserved it. Imagine, one last time, the soft light falling across the rolls of papyrus, the smooth feel of ancient parchment under your fingertips. You can almost hear the soft rustle of a scholar unrolling a scroll, the faint scratch of a reed pen on a fresh sheet, the quiet murmur of a librarian's voice. These weren't just buildings filled with old books. They were living, breathing spaces of thought, contemplation, and the slow, steady accumulation of human knowledge. They were places where ideas took root, where stories were shared across centuries, and where the human desire to understand the world and ourselves found its most tangible expression. The weight of history in these quiet corners is almost palpable, a comforting presence. The sun begins to set in our imagined ancient city, casting long, peaceful shadows across the library floor. The air grows cooler, and the faint sounds of the bustling world outside grow even more distant, almost imperceptible. The knowledge held within these scrolls, whether a grand epic poem, a complex mathematical theorem, or a simple recipe for ancient bread, is now gently settling into your mind, a quiet comfort for your drifting thoughts. You've journeyed through the meticulous efforts of scribes, the clever systems of librarians, and the myriad threats that these precious texts faced. You've caught glimpses of human humor in the margins and wondered at the vastness of lost knowledge. It's all part of the grand, slow dance of history. Allow the lingering image of these quiet halls, filled with their ancient secrets, to soothe your mind. The work of those long ago individuals, meticulously copying and preserving, ensures that even today, centuries later, their quiet whispers can reach us. The very silence of a library, once a place of intense study, now becomes a gentle invitation to rest. Let your breathing become even slower, softer. The weight of the scrolls, the faint scent of cedar, the distant murmuring of scholars, they are all fading now, dissolving into the peaceful quiet. The journey through the secret lives of books is complete, and the only task left is to surrender to the tranquility.